Every genie you know is a lie. The real jinn ruled invisible kingdoms, possessed moral agency equal to humans, and shaped Middle Eastern civilization for millennia before Islam transformed them from autonomous fire spirits into either allies or enemies of divine guidance. These weren't wish-granting slaves trapped in lamps. They were beings of smokeless fire who negotiated with prophets, commanded respect from kings, and maintained complex diplomatic relationships with human tribes across the Arabian Peninsula. Relationships that determined whether caravans reached their destinations and whether wells continued to flow. So before we explore how pre-Islamic Arabia developed one of history's most sophisticated systems of supernatural diplomacy, hit that like button if you're ready to discover the real jinn behind the Disney fantasies, and let me know in the comments. What's the strangest unexplained experience you've ever had that made you wonder if invisible intelligences might actually exist? Step into the world that existed before monotheism reshaped the supernatural landscape. In the time before the Prophet walked among mortals, when Arabia was a patchwork of tribes bound by blood and divided by sand, the jinn ruled the spaces between worlds, with authority older than any caliph would ever claim. They dwelt in the shimmer that rises from sun-baked stone, in the silence that follows the last echo of thunder, in the moment when day surrenders to night and shadows take on substance that daylight never allows them to possess. The Bedouin knew their names as intimately as they knew the names of their own ancestors. Ghul, the shapeshifter who haunted the bones of travelers who died lost and alone in the vastness that swallows armies and leaves no trace. Esila, the flame dancer whose beauty could drive men to madness, whose laughter scattered like sparks from cooking fires to ignite desires that consumed entire lineages in feuds that lasted generations. Marid, the ancient ones who remembered when the world was young, who possessed knowledge that could unlock the secrets of stars and stones, and the hidden springs that meant the difference between life and death in the unforgiving country that stretched beyond any horizon. This was not the tamed Arabia of mosques and minarets, of trade routes regulated by imperial decree, of nomads settling into the rhythm of prayer times that would one day govern the peninsula from Mecca to the Syrian gates. This was the wild Arabia of jinn fire, where spirits moved with the authority of natural forces, where the invisible world pressed so close to the visible that the boundary between them existed more as suggestion than law, where human beings understood themselves to be participants in rather than masters of the vast drama that played out beneath stars that burned with the same cold fire that animated the beings who watched from just beyond the edge of sight. The poetry that survives from this time carries their presence like smoke carries the scent of distant fires. Imru al-Qais, the wandering prince whose verses would outlive the kingdoms that cast him into exile, speaks of riding through valleys where jinn maidens dance in moonlight, their forms shifting between woman and flame, between promise and peril, between blessing and curse, depending on the courtesy shown by mortals who encounter them in the dangerous hours when day releases its hold and night claims dominion over the desert spaces. I have seen the Ghul, he writes, and she is fair as dawn, breaking over dunes that have drunk the blood of heroes. She speaks in riddles that contain the wisdom of serpents, offers water that slakes all thirst, or feeds all hunger depending on the heart that receives her gifts. The fool who approaches her with lust discovers drought. The wise man who greets her with respect drinks deep of knowledge that no human teacher could provide. But the jinn were not mere literary devices, poetic ornaments decorating verses composed for the entertainment of desert courts. They were the living inhabitants of an ecology that included more dimensions than the purely physical, beings whose reality was confirmed not by philosophy, but by experience, not by theology, but by the practical necessity of maintaining proper relationships with forces that could determine whether caravans reached their destinations, whether wells continued to flow, whether the delicate balance between human ambition and natural limits remained stable enough to permit survival in country that forgave no errors and offered no second chances. The Banu Asad knew the Ghul who haunted the approaches to their territory, the specific Jinn woman whose domain encompassed the rocky hills where their flocks grazed and their warriors trained for battles that would be forgotten by history but remembered by the stones that witnessed their courage. They left offerings of dates and milk at the boulder that served as her throne, spoke her name with the respect due to a neighboring chief whose friendship was valuable and whose enmity was fatal. The offerings were not worship in the sense that later religions would understand the term, but practical diplomacy with powers that possessed legitimate interests in the landscape, that had claims older than any human settlement, that required acknowledgement not because they demanded it, but because ignoring them led to consequences that no amount of human courage or cunning could remedy. When the wells began to fail, when the rains came at the wrong times or not at all, when strange sicknesses struck the herds and children were born with marks that spoke of influences beyond normal causation, the tribal elders knew to examine their relationship with the Jinn whose territory they shared. Had the proper courtesies been observed? Had the ancient agreements been honored? Had some young warrior's pride led him to speak carelessly of beings whose power was not to be tested by those whose own existence was as fragile as morning mist in the desert heat? The Banu Tamim told stories of the Esela who dwelt in their oasis, the flame spirit whose moods governed the health of the date palms that provided both food and shelter for their settlement. She appeared most often at twilight, when the air itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of some vast heart that beat in harmony with forces that moved the stars in their courses. Her beauty was terrible, not because it was false, but because it was true, because it revealed the divine fire that burns at the heart of existence, the creative principle that brings forth life and consumes it in the same eternal moment. The young men who caught glimpses of her dancing among the palm fronds learned to avert their eyes, not from shame, but from wisdom, understanding that mortal vision was not equipped to look directly upon the naked power that animated the world. The older women who tended the oasis spoke to her in the language of mothers, offering the small gifts that acknowledged her as the eldest daughter of the place, the one whose presence blessed their water and whose absence would return their green sanctuary to the sand that waited patiently to reclaim all human pretensions to permanence. But the Jinn were not confined to the Arabian Peninsula or to the particular religious and cultural systems that would emerge from the desert revelations. Their kinship extended backward through time and outward through space to encompass the vast family of fire spirits that populated the mythologies of peoples who had never heard of Mecca or Medina, who spoke languages that bore no resemblance to Arabic, who worshipped gods whose names would be forgotten long before the prophet's mission began. In the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, the Lilu roam through the same liminal spaces that Jinn would later inhabit, the thresholds between human and divine realms, where spirits moved with autonomy that neither mortals nor gods could entirely control. The Lilu possessed the same moral ambiguity that characterized the Jinn, capable of great harm or great assistance depending on how they were approached, what offerings they received, what respect was shown to their nature and their needs. The linguistic connections run deeper than mere coincidence. The Arabic word jinn shares roots with the Akkadian jinnu, both pointing toward concepts of hiddenness, invisibility, the quality of existing beyond the range of ordinary perception. But the connections extend beyond language into the realm of function and relationship, the role these beings played in mediating between human communities and the forces that governed their survival and prosperity. The Pazuzu of Babylonian demonology bears the same dual nature that would later characterize the Jinn, a being of wind and storm who could bring destruction or protection depending on the circumstances of encounter, the intentions of those who sought his aid, the offerings made to secure his favor. His image, carved in bronze and stone, shows the same composite nature that Jinn would later embody. Part human, part animal, part elemental force. A being that transcended the categories that human thought used to organize reality into manageable portions. In the Zoroastrian traditions of Persia, the Daeva occupy the same moral middle ground that Jinn would later claim. Spirits who possessed free will and moral agency, who could choose to serve the light or the darkness, who required careful attention and skillful relationship rather than simple worship or straightforward banishment. The Zoroastrian understanding that the cosmic battle between good and evil was fought not just between gods and demons, but within the hearts and minds of beings who possessed the freedom to choose their allegiance, would later influence Islamic thinking about the jinn and their role in the divine economy. But perhaps the most striking parallel appears in the pre-Islamic religious practices of the Arabian tribes themselves, the rituals and relationships that govern their interactions with the invisible inhabitants of their territories. The sacred stones that mark jinn dwelling places, the springs where water was offered to spirits whose presence ensured the continued flow of the source, the groves where dates and milk were left for beings whose favor could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. The Kaaba itself, the black stone that would become the focal point of Islamic pilgrimage, was recognized in pre-Islamic times as a dwelling place of spirits, a point of contact between the visible and invisible worlds that required careful approach and proper etiquette from those who sought to benefit from its proximity to divine forces. The circling ritual that surrounded the stone, the offerings that were left in its vicinity, the prayers that were addressed to the powers that inhabited its vicinity. All of these practices acknowledged the presence of beings whose nature transcended simple human categories of understanding. The jinn who gathered in such places were not abstract theological concepts, but concrete presences whose reality was confirmed by experience, whose personalities could be known through relationship, whose aid could be sought and whose anger could be avoided through the practical wisdom that governed all successful diplomacy between different orders of existence. They possessed names and preferences, territories and rivalries, moods and needs that changed with the seasons and the phases of the moon, and the complex interactions between forces that human intelligence could observe but never fully comprehend. The poetry that celebrated their beauty, the stories that recounted their interactions with human heroes and heroines, the rituals that maintained proper relationships with their communities. All of these cultural expressions reflected a worldview that took for granted the multiplicity of intelligent life, the complexity of moral relationships that extended beyond the human species, the necessity of maintaining balance between the needs of different orders of beings who shared the same landscapes but operated according to different principles and priorities. The transition from the pre-Islamic to the Islamic period represented not the destruction of jinn culture, but its transformation, not the elimination of fire spirits, but their integration into a new theological framework that found ways to accommodate beings whose reality was too evident to deny, whose usefulness was too great to abandon, whose power was too significant to ignore. But that transformation would come with costs and complications that the desert tribes could not foresee. Changes that would alter not just the names by which jinn were known, but the fundamental understanding of their nature and their relationship to human beings. The moral ambiguity that had always characterized jinn interactions with mortals would be reframed in terms of a cosmic battle between good and evil that left little room for the complex middle ground that jinn had always occupied. The desert remembers what the cities have forgotten, and in that memory, the jinn remain what they have always been. Beings of smokeless fire who burn with the same creative energy that ignites stars and kindles. Consciousness, spirits who possess the freedom that comes from existing beyond the boundaries that define and limit purely human experience. Allies and adversaries whose relationships with mortals reflect the eternal dance between order and chaos, creation and destruction, the known and the unknown that gives meaning and mystery to the beautiful, terrible adventure of existence itself. The night at Nakhla changes everything. and the jinn themselves bear witness. Muhammad walks alone through the valley, where acacia thorns catch starlight like scattered prayers, where the silence holds weight that presses against the soul with the authority of divine presence. The year is 620 AD, and the prophet carries in his heart the burden of rejection from his own people, the ache of a message that Mecca will not hear, the loneliness that comes when truth speaks through mortal lips and finds no echo in mortal hearts. But he is not alone in the darkness that stretches between the known world and the realm of revelation. In the shadows cast by rocks older than human memory, beings of smokeless fire gather to listen as words pour from heaven through a voice that speaks not just to human souls, but to all creation, that possesses the capacity to recognize divine authority when it breaks through the barriers that separate the eternal from the temporal. The jinn have come to Nakhla as they have come to countless other gatherings where power moves through the world, drawn by the same magnetic pull that brings lightning to high places, that calls water to the lowest ground, that draws consciousness toward whatever source offers the possibility of meaning in a universe that reveals its secrets only to those who approach with the proper combination of courage and humility. What they hear transforms not just their understanding of the divine plan, but their place within it, their role in the vast drama that connects every grain of sand to every distant star, every human breath to every movement of wind across the desert spaces that have always been their domain. For the first time since their creation, from the flames that burn without fuel, the jinn encounter a message that speaks to them directly, that acknowledges their existence not as footnotes to human spiritual development, but as participants in their own right in the cosmic conversation between creator and creation. Say, "It has been revealed to me that a company of jinn listened and said, 'We have heard a wondrous Quran, which guides to the right path, and we have believed therein. We shall not join anyone with our Lord.'" The words of Surah Al-Jinn carry within their rhythmic Arabic the sound of recognition, the echo of voices that belong to beings who possess the same capacity for choice that makes human beings moral agents rather than mere instruments of divine will. The jinn who gather at Nakhla do not submit to Islam because they are compelled by force or convinced by argument, but because they recognize in Muhammad's recitation the voice of the same authority that spoke them into existence from the primal fire that burns at the heart of all creation. But their conversion carries implications that will reverberate through 14 centuries of Islamic thought. Questions that will challenge theologians and philosophers and common believers who must reconcile the existence of invisible communities that possess free will, moral agency, and the capacity for both salvation and damnation with religious systems that were primarily designed to address human spiritual needs. If jinn can choose faith or disbelief, if they can be righteous or rebellious, if they can enter paradise or suffer punishment in hell, what does this say about the nature of divine justice, the scope of prophetic missions, the boundaries of communities that must learn to coexist, not just across cultural and linguistic differences, but across the fundamental divide between beings of flesh and beings of fire? The Quranic revelation that addresses this complexity begins with cosmology, with the fundamental statement that places jinn within the created order while distinguishing them from both angels and humans through their unique origin and nature. And he created jinn from a smokeless flame of fire, the verse in Surah Al-Rahman declares, locating them in the elemental hierarchy that runs from the clay that forms human bodies to the light that gives substance to angelic beings, to the fire that animates spirits whose very existence bridges the gap between material and immaterial existence. The smokeless fire that shapes jinn represents something different from ordinary combustion, something that burns without consuming its fuel, that gives light without casting shadow, that possesses the capacity for both creation and destruction while remaining itself unchanged by the processes it initiates. This is the fire of consciousness itself, the flame of awareness that burns in every thinking being, the spark that connects individual minds to the universal intelligence that governs the movement of galaxies and the falling of leaves and the choices made by spirits who possess the terrible freedom to accept or reject the guidance that heaven offers to all creation. But the Quranic treatment of jinn refuses to reduce them to simple categories that would make them easier to understand or control. Unlike angels, who are described as beings created from light who have no choice but to obey divine commands, jinn possess the same moral freedom that makes human beings capable of both greatness and corruption, both submission to divine will and rebellion against cosmic order. This freedom makes them dangerous allies and formidable enemies, beings who must be approached with the same careful attention that governs diplomacy between human communities, whose interests may converge or conflict depending on circumstances beyond any single participant's control. The figure of Iblis, who appears throughout the Quran as the supreme example of jinn rebellion, illustrates both the potential and the peril that comes with supernatural free will. Unlike Christian theology, which identifies Satan as a fallen angel whose rebellion represents the corruption of perfect obedience, Islamic thought recognizes Iblis as a jinn whose refusal to prostrate before Adam stems not from the corruption of angelic nature, but from the exercise of jinn autonomy, the capacity for choice that makes both salvation and damnation possible for beings of fire. And when we said to the angels, "Prostrate to Adam," they prostrated, except Iblis. He was of the jinn, and he departed from the command of his Lord. The verse locates Iblis's rebellion not in the corruption of divine nature, but in the assertion of jinn independence, the refusal to accept subordination to human beings who are formed from clay rather than fire, who possess bodies that bind them to earth rather than spirits that move freely through dimensions that material existence cannot contain. Iblis's crime is not the violation of absolute divine command, but the misuse of legitimate jinn autonomy, the transformation of freedom into arrogance, of independence into rebellion against the harmony that connects all creation in webs of mutual service and reciprocal blessing. This theological innovation creates a new category of spiritual being, entities who possess the moral agency that distinguishes them from angels, while lacking the physical limitations that constrain human choices, spirits who can serve as allies in the quest for righteousness, or as tempters who lead souls away from the path that connects individual will to cosmic purpose. The jinn who choose Islam become partners in the great work of establishing divine order on earth, while those who reject guidance become obstacles to be overcome, forces that must be resisted rather than eliminated, opponents whose very opposition serves the divine plan by creating the conditions under which moral choice becomes meaningful rather than automatic. The Quran's acknowledgement of jinn moral complexity extends to their social organization, their family structures, their cultural variations that mirror and sometimes surpass human diversity. The jinn who listened at Nakhla report back to their communities about the new revelation, engage in theological discussions that parallel those occurring among human converts, face the same challenges of integrating new religious obligations with traditional practices and relationships. And among us are the righteous, and among us are others not so. We were groups having different ways. The jinn who speak in Surah Al-Jinn describe their own communities in language that could apply equally well to human societies. Diverse, complex, divided by different approaches to moral and spiritual questions, united by shared nature, but differentiated by individual choices and cultural variations. This diversity means that human encounters with jinn cannot be governed by simple rules that apply uniformly to all fire spirits, but must take into account the specific characteristics of each individual fire spirit, account the individual nature and moral orientation of particular beings whose intentions may be benevolent, malevolent, or simply indifferent to human welfare. The Quran provides guidance for such encounters while refusing to eliminate the complexity that makes each interaction a unique spiritual challenge, requiring wisdom, courage, and careful attention to the signs that reveal whether particular jinn serve divine purposes or pursue their own agendas, regardless of the consequences for human communities. The institution of the Qareen, the jinn companion assigned to every human being, illustrates the intimate connection between fire and clay beings that Islamic cosmology takes for granted. Unlike the Christian concept of guardian angels who protect humans from spiritual harm, the Qareen serves a more ambiguous function, acting sometimes as protector and sometimes as tempter, sometimes as advisor and sometimes as adversary, reflecting the moral complexity that characterizes all jinn relationships with mortals. And whoever is blinded to the remembrance of the Most Merciful, we appoint for him a devil from the jinn, and he is to him a companion. The Quranic description of this relationship refuses to present it in simple terms of good versus evil, protection versus temptation, but rather as an ongoing dialogue between different aspects of consciousness, different possibilities for spiritual development that remain open as long as free will persists in choosing between alternatives that lead toward or away from divine guidance. The Qareen represents the jinn nature that exists within human consciousness itself, the fire that burns in every soul, the capacity for both illumination and destruction that comes with the gift of moral freedom. Learning to maintain proper relationship with one's Qareen becomes a metaphor for learning to integrate the wild, autonomous aspects of consciousness with the disciplined submission that Islam requires, finding the balance between spiritual independence and divine obedience that allows both human and jinn natures to serve their proper functions in the cosmic order. But perhaps the most radical innovation in Quranic jinn theology concerns their role in the invisible world, the ghaib that encompasses all dimensions of existence beyond the reach of ordinary human perception. The Quran presents jinn not as supernatural beings who occasionally intrude into natural processes, but as permanent inhabitants of parallel dimensions that intersect with human reality at countless points, invisible communities whose activities influence human affairs in ways that can be recognized by those who know how to read the signs, but remain hidden from those who limit their attention to purely material causation. This understanding transforms the practice of religion from a purely human activity into a cosmic collaboration between different orders of intelligent beings who share responsibility for establishing divine order throughout all levels of creation. The righteous jinn become allies in the struggle against forces that oppose divine guidance, while rebellious jinn join the ranks of those who seek to corrupt and mislead souls that might otherwise find their way to salvation. The prayers that acknowledge jinn presence, the protective formulas that ward off harmful fire spirits, the invocations that seek assistance from righteous jinn, all of these practices reflect the practical recognition that spiritual life occurs in a universe populated by intelligent beings whose moral choices affect not just their own destinies, but the welfare of all creation that shares the same cosmic neighborhood. The early Islamic scholars who struggled to interpret these revelations found themselves working with theological material that challenged many of the assumptions that governed other religious traditions. Ibn Abbas, the Prophet's cousin whose interpretations would influence centuries of Quranic commentary, emphasized the literal reality of jinn existence while warning against the dangers of seeking their aid without proper spiritual preparation and divine permission. Al-Tabari, whose massive commentary remains one of the most authoritative works of Quranic interpretation, devoted extensive attention to jinn-related verses, collecting hadith traditions that documented the Prophet's own encounters with fire spirits and his teachings about the proper relationship between human and jinn communities. His work reveals the careful balance that early Islamic thought maintained between acknowledging jinn reality and preventing their worship, between recognizing their power and maintaining human spiritual independence. The hadith collections of Bukhari and Muslim preserve accounts of Muhammad's direct dealings with jinn, stories that reveal his approach to beings whose nature made them both potential allies and potential threats to the Muslim community he was building. These traditions speak of jinn who came seeking instruction in Islamic practice, of harmful spirits who were bound and controlled through Quranic recitation, of protective invocations that could shield believers from jinn mischief, while maintaining proper respect for their legitimate existence and rights. But the most significant development in Islamic jinn theology concerned the question of prophetic mission and divine guidance. If jinn possessed free will and moral accountability, if they could choose faith or disbelief, if they could be saved or damned based on their response to divine revelation, did this mean that they required their own prophets, their own revelations, their own religious communities organized according to principles that took account of their unique nature and needs? The Quranic answer to this question established Muhammad as a prophet, sent not just to human beings, but to both humans and jinn, a messenger whose revelation addressed the spiritual needs of all intelligent creation that possessed the capacity for moral choice. This universal scope of prophetic mission transformed Islam from a purely human religion into a cosmic faith that encompassed all thinking beings, regardless of their elemental composition, their physical form, their location in the visible or invisible dimensions of existence. O company of jinn and mankind, did there not come to you messengers from among you, relating to you my verses and warning you of the meeting of this day of yours? The question posed in Surah Al-An'am acknowledges jinn as legitimate recipients of divine guidance, while holding them accountable for their response to the messages that heaven sends to all creation, capable of understanding moral obligation and spiritual possibility. This acknowledgement carried practical implications that would influence Islamic law, theology, and spiritual practice for centuries to come. If jinn could be Muslims, could they participate in human religious communities? Could they marry humans? Could they serve as witnesses in legal proceedings? Could they inherit property? Could they be held responsible for crimes committed against human victims? The jurisprudential questions raised by jinn inclusion in the Islamic community required careful attention to both theological principle and practical necessity, recognition that acknowledging jinn moral agency created responsibilities and opportunities that had no precedent in other religious traditions. The legal scholars who addressed these questions found themselves creating new categories of Islamic law that took account of beings whose nature transcended the normal boundaries between visible and invisible, material and immaterial, human and non-human existence. But beyond the legal and theological complexities, the Quranic recognition of jinn moral agency carried spiritual implications that transformed the very understanding of what it meant to be a conscious being in a universe created and governed by divine wisdom. The revelation that spoke to jinn at Nakhla established consciousness itself as the criterion for moral responsibility, the capacity for choice as the foundation of spiritual development, the freedom to accept or reject divine guidance as the characteristic that connected all thinking beings in the same cosmic community, regardless of their origin, their form, their location in the hierarchy of creation. The night at Nakhla becomes the moment when the invisible world officially enters the Islamic dispensation, when beings of fire accept the same revelation that would transform human civilization, when the jinn who had ruled the spaces between worlds for millennia before Muhammad's birth acknowledge a new authority that claims jurisdiction not just over human souls, but over all creation that possesses the capacity for conscious relationship with the divine source of all existence. The implications of this transformation would unfold over centuries as Islamic civilization grappled with the practical and theoretical challenges of living in a universe where invisible neighbors possess their own moral agency, their own spiritual destinies, their own claims to consideration in the great work of establishing divine order on earth and in all the dimensions that surround and interpenetrate the visible world. But the fundamental change had already occurred in that valley, where acacia thorns caught starlight like scattered prayers, where jinn voices joined human voices in acknowledging the authority that speaks through prophetic revelation, where the invisible world officially entered the covenant that would reshape not just human understanding, but the cosmic order itself, creating new possibilities for collaboration between fire and clay, new responsibilities for beings whose consciousness burned with the same divine spark, regardless of the elemental matrix that gave form to their awareness. The revelation continues, and the jinn who heard it first carry its implications into dimensions where human foot will never tread, but where divine guidance must still be acknowledged, where moral choices must still be made, where the great work of creation continues through the decisions made by all beings who possess the terrible and wonderful freedom to choose their own relationship to the source and goal of all existence. The Ifrit stands at the crossroads where four paths meet, and its choice will damn kingdoms or save them. In the ruins of what was once a prosperous trading city, where sand has reclaimed the marketplaces and wind whistles through empty doorways that once echoed with the voices of merchants haggling over prices that seemed important before the Jinn Wars began, the traveller finds the first sign that not all fire spirits serve the same master, follow the same moral code, pursue the same relationship with the human communities that share their world. The building that houses the Ifrit bears no resemblance to the temples or churches or mosques that human beings construct to contain their worship. It is a place of raw power made manifest in stone and flame, where the air itself shimmers with heat that has nothing to do with the desert sun, where shadows move with purpose that suggests intelligence operating according to laws that transcend human understanding of cause and effect. But the traveller who approaches with the proper mixture of courage and humility discovers that the Ifrit who dwells in this place is neither the mindless destroyer of Christian demonology, nor the wish-granting servant of Western fantasy. It is something far more complex and therefore far more dangerous. A being of immense power and ancient wisdom whose moral compass operates according to principles that may align with human welfare or oppose it depending on circumstances that only the Ifrit itself fully comprehends. I have ruled this crossroads for 7 centuries. The Ifrit speaks in a voice like wind through burning coals. And in that time, I have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of prophets, the endless cycle of human ambition and divine judgment. I have blessed the just and cursed the wicked, protected the innocent and punished the guilty, served the cause of righteousness and opposed the forces of corruption. Yet mortal tongues call me demon, and mortal hearts fear me as an enemy of all that is good and holy. This is the riddle that Islamic civilization has struggled with for 14 centuries. How to understand beings whose power equals or exceeds that of angels, but whose moral orientation cannot be predetermined, whose assistance may prove invaluable in the quest for righteousness, but whose opposition can lead to disasters that destroy generations. The jinn exist in a moral middle ground that defies the simple categories of good and evil that make other spiritual traditions more comfortable but less accurate in their representation of how divine justice actually operates in a universe where free will creates genuine moral complexity. The Quran itself acknowledges this complexity by refusing to present jinn as a uniform category of beings whose nature can be understood through simple generalizations. And among us are the righteous, and among us are those less than that. We were sects with different ways, the jinn testify about themselves, describing communities as diverse and morally varied as any human society, populated by individuals whose spiritual development ranges from near sainthood to active rebellion against divine guidance. Malik al-Ahmar, the Red King, whose domain encompasses the volcanic islands where Earth's fire meets heaven's air, represents the aristocratic tradition among jinn, beings of such ancient lineage and accumulated power that their decisions affect not just individual humans, but entire civilizations. The legends that surround him speak of a ruler whose sense of justice operates on scales too vast for human comprehension, who may allow cities to flourish for centuries as reward for a single act of kindness shown to a jinn traveler, or who may condemn regions to drought and discord as punishment for insults offered to fire spirits who sought nothing more than basic courtesy from the mortals they encountered. But Malik al-Ahmar's justice, however harsh its implementation, serves principles that Islamic theology can recognize as legitimate. His protection of the weak against the strong, his punishment of those who break oaths and betray trusts, his reward of courage and generosity and wisdom, all of these reflect the same moral values that the Quran upholds as fundamental to righteous living. The problem lies not in his moral orientation, but in his methods, not in his goals, but in his willingness to use means that human beings find terrifying in their scope and finality. The Marad who dwell in the depths of seas that have no names represent a different aspect of jinn moral complexity. These are beings whose power stems not from fire alone, but from the marriage of flame and water, spirits who embody the paradox of elements that should destroy each other, but instead create forms of existence that transcend the limitations of either component. Their rebellion against easy categorization extends to their moral nature, which combines the fierce independence of fire with the flowing adaptability of water, creating personalities that can shift from benevolence to malevolence as quickly as waves change direction in a storm. Barkan the Turbulent, whose presence can be felt in the waterspouts that appear without warning off coasts where human ships venture too far from familiar shores, embodies the married nature that finds human attempts at moral classification amusing when they are not insulting. He has been known to rescue drowning sailors from storms that he himself created, to guide lost vessels to safety after leading them into peril, to reward those who show proper respect for his domain while destroying those who treat the sea as their personal property rather than recognizing it as his ancient kingdom. The stories told by survivors of married encounters reveal beings whose sense of justice operates according to oceanic rather than terrestrial principles, vast, deep, subject to currents and tides that follow patterns too complex for surface observation to discern. What appears as capricious cruelty may actually be the implementation of laws that govern relationships between different orders of existence, punishment for violations of protocols that humans never knew existed, enforcement of boundaries that protect both jinn and human communities from conflicts that could escalate beyond any single generation's ability to resolve. But perhaps the most intimate example of jinn moral complexity appears in the institution of the Qareen, the fire spirit companion assigned to every human being from birth to death, whose relationship with its mortal partner illustrates the full range of possibilities that exist when beings of different natures must learn to coexist within the same consciousness, the same life story, the same moral trajectory that leads toward either salvation or damnation. The Qareen represents the jinn aspects of human nature itself, the wild, autonomous, creative, destructive energies that burn within every soul, that can serve either divine purposes or selfish ones, depending on how they are acknowledged, channeled, integrated into the total personality that each individual must forge from the raw materials of their own deepest nature. Unlike the Christian concept of demonic temptation that presents evil as external force seeking to corrupt essentially good human nature, the Islamic understanding of the Qareen locates moral struggle within consciousness itself, in the ongoing dialogue between fire and clay aspects of identity that must learn to work together rather than against each other. The Hadith traditions preserve accounts of the Prophet's own relationship with his Qareen, the fire spirit, whose conversion to Islam transformed it from potential tempter to spiritual ally, demonstrating that even the most intimate jinn relationships can be governed by moral choice rather than predetermined by nature. Every one of you has been assigned a companion from the jinn, Muhammad taught his followers, but Allah has helped me against mine. So he became Muslim, and he commands me to do only good. This teaching suggests that the moral orientation of one's Qareen depends not just on the jinn's own choices, but on the quality of relationship that the human partner establishes, the degree of spiritual development that allows fire and clay to serve the same divine purposes, rather than competing for dominance over the shared consciousness they must jointly inhabit. The Qareen who serves a righteous human becomes an ally in the struggle against temptation, while the Qareen who serves a corrupt human becomes an additional source of spiritual danger. But the relationship works both ways. Just as humans can influence their Qareen toward righteousness or corruption, the fire spirit can influence its human partner toward illumination or spiritual blindness, toward expanded consciousness or trapped awareness, toward integration with divine purposes or rebellion against cosmic order. This mutual influence means that spiritual development becomes a collaborative project between different aspects of consciousness, different elemental natures working toward common goals that serve both individual welfare and collective harmony. The theological complexity of jinn morality appears most clearly in the legal traditions that developed around human-jinn interactions. The jurisprudential questions that required scholars to determine when fire spirit involvement in human affairs should be considered legitimate, and when it should be condemned as harmful innovation that threatens religious orthodoxy and social stability. Ibn Taymiyyah, whose treatise on jinn remains one of the most authoritative works in Islamic scholarship, approached these questions with characteristic intellectual rigor, distinguishing between jinn activities that serve legitimate purposes and those that constitute harmful interference in human spiritual development. His analysis reveals the careful balance that Islamic thought maintains between acknowledging jinn reality and preventing their worship, between recognizing their power and maintaining human moral responsibility. The righteous among the jinn, Ibn Taymiyyah writes, may assist humans in lawful activities, protecting them from harm, providing them with knowledge that serves righteous purposes, helping them to overcome obstacles that prevent them from fulfilling their religious obligations. But humans who seek such assistance must ensure that they approach jinn as fellow Muslims, rather than as objects of worship, that they maintain their own spiritual independence while accepting appropriate help from fire spirit allies. This distinction between legitimate cooperation and illegitimate dependence requires spiritual discernment that many humans lack, the ability to recognize when jinn assistance serves divine purposes and when it serves only the jinn's own agenda or the human's worldly desires at the expense of spiritual development. The criteria for making such distinctions include the methods used to contact jinn, the purposes for which their aid is sought, the effects that their assistance produces on human moral and spiritual development. Jinn who require elaborate rituals, expensive offerings, or actions that violate Islamic ethical principles reveal themselves as beings whose assistance comes at costs that outweigh any temporary benefits they might provide. Fire spirits who demand worship, submission, or exclusive loyalty demonstrate that their own spiritual development remains incomplete, that their conversion to Islam serves their personal interests rather than their genuine recognition of divine authority. But jinn whose assistance can be sought through simple prayer, who ask for nothing more than respectful treatment and occasional expressions of gratitude, who help humans to fulfill their religious obligations rather than neglecting them, reveal themselves as genuine Muslim allies whose fire spirit nature serves the same cosmic purposes as human clay nature when both are properly oriented toward divine guidance. The distinction becomes crucial in understanding the role that jinn play in Islamic magical traditions, the practices that seek to harness fire spirit power for purposes that range from legitimate healing and protection to illegitimate manipulation and harm. The same jinn who can assist in the cure of diseases that resist medical treatment can also be invoked to cause those diseases, who can protect against spiritual attack can also launch such attacks, who can provide knowledge that serves wisdom can also spread information that serves only selfish ambition. Al-Suyuti, whose works on jinn represent some of the most sophisticated theological analysis of fire spirit morality, emphasized that the key factor in determining the legitimacy of jinn magic lies not in the power itself, but in the purposes for which it is used and the methods by which it is obtained. Magic that serves divine purposes, healing, protection, the spread of knowledge, the establishment of justice, may legitimately employ jinn assistance as long as proper spiritual protocols are maintained and the ultimate authority of divine guidance is acknowledged. But magic that serves purely worldly purposes, wealth, power, revenge, the satisfaction of desires that conflict with divine wisdom, corrupts both the human practitioner and the jinn allies who participate in such activities, leading both toward spiritual states that oppose rather than serve the cosmic harmony that divine guidance seeks to establish throughout all levels of creation. The regional variations in jinn moral understanding reveal how different Islamic cultures have interpreted the basic Quranic principles according to their own experiences with fire spirit communities, their own historical encounters with beneficial and harmful jinn, their own spiritual traditions that preceded their conversion to Islam and influenced their understanding of how divine justice operates through invisible as well as visible agents. In Morocco, the jinn known as the Mouloun govern relationships between human families and the ancestral spirits who continue to take interest in their descendants' welfare, serving as intermediaries who can facilitate communication between the living and the dead when such communication serves legitimate spiritual purposes. These jinn operate according to moral codes that emphasize family loyalty, respect for elders, and the maintenance of traditional wisdom that connects each generation to the accumulated spiritual resources of their lineage. But the same jinn can become sources of family discord when they are approached with selfish motives, when they are asked to favor one family member over others, when their assistance is sought for purposes that violate the moral obligations that bind families together across the boundaries that separate earthly from otherworldly existence. The key to maintaining proper relationships with the Mouloun lies in approaching them as protectors of family harmony rather than as servants of individual ambition. In Indonesia, the jinn known as Jin Bukit dwell in the mountains that rise from tropical seas like islands of fire reaching toward heaven, spirits whose moral nature reflects the volcanic landscapes they inhabit. Creative and destructive, fertile and dangerous, capable of bringing forth new life or consuming established forms depending on how they are approached by human communities that share their territories. The Jin Bukit serve as guardians of ecological balance, protecting forest and mountain ecosystems from exploitation that threatens their long-term sustainability. But they can also destroy human settlements that ignore proper environmental protocols, that take more than they need, that fail to maintain reciprocal relationships with the natural systems that support all life in their regions. The moral complexity of these jinn reflects the environmental ethics that Indonesian Islam developed through centuries of living in landscapes where human survival depends on maintaining proper relationships with natural forces that possess their own intelligence, their own rights, their own capacity for beneficial or harmful responses to human behavior. In Central Asia, the jinn known as Peri embody the moral ambiguity that characterizes all fire spirit relationships with mortals, beings of extraordinary beauty and power. who can serve as spiritual guides for those who approach them with proper preparation and pure intentions, but who can also lead seekers astray when they are approached with selfish desires or insufficient spiritual development to handle the knowledge and power that such relationships make available. The Peri traditions preserved in Sufi literature describe jinn, whose assistance can accelerate spiritual development beyond what human effort alone could achieve, but whose aid comes with dangers that only mature spiritual practitioners can successfully navigate. These fire spirits serve as tests of spiritual readiness, revealing through their responses to human seekers whether those seekers possess the wisdom, humility, and ethical development necessary to handle expanded consciousness without being corrupted by it. The moral complexity of jinn-human relationships ultimately reflects the broader Islamic understanding that spiritual development occurs in a universe populated by intelligent beings whose choices affect not just their own destinies, but the welfare of all creation that shares the same cosmic neighborhood. The jinn who choose righteousness become allies in the great work of establishing divine order throughout all dimensions of existence, while those who choose rebellion become obstacles that must be overcome through spiritual strength rather than eliminated through physical force. This understanding transforms the practice of religion from a purely human activity into a cosmic collaboration between different orders of conscious beings who share responsibility for the moral development of the universe itself. The prayers that acknowledge jinn presence, the protective formulas that maintain proper boundaries between fire and clay communities, the invocations that seek assistance from righteous jinn while warding off harmful ones. All of these practices reflect the recognition that spiritual life occurs in a universe where moral choices have consequences that extend far beyond the individual consciousness that makes them. The Ifrit stands at the crossroads where four paths meet, and its choice will indeed damn kingdoms or save them. But the same can be said of every human soul who faces moral decisions, every jinn who must choose between service and rebellion, every conscious being who participates in the ongoing creation of a universe whose ultimate destiny depends on the accumulated choices made by all who possess the freedom to accept or reject the guidance that heaven offers to fire and clay alike. The moral complexity of jinn reveals the moral complexity of existence itself, the recognition that divine justice operates through relationships between beings whose freedom to choose makes both salvation and damnation possible, whose cooperation can establish paradise on earth, while whose conflict can create hells that consume both the righteous and the wicked in flames that burn with the same fire from which jinn were created, and to which all creation must return when the great work of cosmic development reaches its ultimate completion. The book opens at midnight, and the words written in fire begin to burn. In the hidden library beneath the madrasa at Damascus, where dust motes dance in shafts of lamplight that penetrate chambers sealed since the Mongol invasions, the scholar's trembling fingers trace Arabic script that seems to writhe beneath his touch like living serpents, letters that pulse with heat that has nothing to do with the oil flame that casts shadows on walls, lined with volumes that most imams would consign to purifying flames if they knew of their existence. Shams al-Ma'arif wa Lata'if al-Awarif, the book of the son of Gnosis and the subtleties of elevated things. The title alone carries enough theological danger to warrant accusations of heresy, enough practical power to reshape reality according to principles that Orthodox Islam acknowledges, but forbids its adherents to manipulate, enough hidden knowledge to open doorways between worlds that were meant to remain separate until the day of judgment renders all barriers meaningless. But Al-Bunni's masterwork represents more than forbidden knowledge. It embodies the eternal human hunger to participate actively in the cosmic forces that govern existence, rather than accepting the role of passive recipients of divine mercy, to speak with jinn as allies rather than fearing them as enemies, to harness the fire that animates all creation for purposes that serve not just individual ambition, but the establishment of divine order in realms where chaos has ruled since the beginning of time. The scholar who opens this book at midnight knows that he crosses a threshold from which there may be no return, that the knowledge he seeks comes with prices that cannot be calculated in advance, that the jinn who respond to his invocations will judge his worthiness according to criteria that human wisdom cannot anticipate or control. Yet he proceeds because the alternative, accepting ignorance in a universe that pulses with accessible power, remaining passive when action might serve divine purposes, fearing fire spirits who might become allies in the great work of cosmic transformation, seems to him a greater danger than any that proper magical practice could bring. The first page of Al-Bunni's grimoire establishes the theological framework that will govern all subsequent operations, the careful distinction between sihr that serves divine purposes and sihr that opposes them, between magic that enhances the practitioner's submission to Allah and sorcery that increases his rebellion against cosmic order. The Arabic word itself carries both possibilities. Sihr can mean the beneficial magic that prophets and saints employ in their service to divine guidance, or the harmful sorcery that serves only selfish desires and diabolical purposes. Know, O seeker, Al-Bunni writes in letters that seem to glow with their own inner light, that the knowledge contained herein is neither forbidden nor permitted in itself, but takes its moral character from the intentions that guide its use, the methods by which it is obtained, the effects it produces in the soul of the practitioner, and the world that surrounds him. The jinn who assist in these operations are neither angels who cannot disobey nor demons who cannot be redeemed, but beings of fire whose nature makes them capable of both blessing and curse, both guidance and deception, both service to divine will and rebellion against cosmic harmony. The rituals that fill the remaining pages of the grimoire reflect this theological complexity in their elaborate precautions against spiritual corruption, their careful protocols for approaching jinn with proper respect rather than arrogant demands, their insistence that magical practice must enhance rather than replace the conventional religious obligations that connect human souls to divine guidance. The sorcerer who neglects his prayers, who ignores the moral requirements of Islamic law, who seeks power for its own sake rather than in service to righteousness, invites the attention of jinn whose own spiritual development remains incomplete, whose assistance comes at costs that may not become apparent until damage to the practitioner's soul has become irreversible. But the scholar who maintains proper spiritual preparation, who approaches jinn as fellow Muslims seeking to serve the same divine purposes, who uses magical power only when conventional means prove inadequate to address genuine needs, may receive assistance that transcends the limitations of purely human capability while remaining within the boundaries of Islamic orthodoxy. The key lies in understanding that jinn magic is not supernatural intervention in natural processes, but natural law operating according to principles that materialist science has forgotten how to recognize. The amal that fills the central sections of Al-Bunni's work, the practical operations that seek to establish working relationships with specific jinn, reveals the sophisticated psychology that underlies Islamic magical practice. The recognition that successful sorcery requires not just technical knowledge but moral development, not just correct procedures but proper spiritual orientation, not just power over jinn but harmony with them in service to purposes that transcend the narrow interests of either fire or clay beings. Malik al-Ahmar, the Red King whose signature appears throughout the grimoire's jinn-binding ceremonies, demands approaches that acknowledge his aristocratic nature, his vast power, his ancient wisdom accumulated through millennia of observing the rise and fall of human civilizations. The rituals that seek his assistance require offerings that demonstrate genuine respect rather than mere compliance, invocations that address him as an equal rather than a servant, negotiations that acknowledge his own interests rather than assuming his complete submission to human will. I call upon thee, O King of Fire, O Lord of the Burning Throne, not as master to slave, but as believer to believer, not as clay demanding service from fire, but as consciousness seeking alliance with consciousness in the name of Him who created both from His own infinite power. The invocation begins, establishing the theological foundation that will determine whether the Jinn King responds with assistance or opposition, with blessing or curse, with the revelation of hidden knowledge, or the imposition of spiritual tests that may prove beyond the practitioner's capacity to endure. The response, when it comes, arrives not through dramatic manifestations that would satisfy the expectations of those who understand magic only through the lens of entertainment, but through subtle shifts in perception, expanded awareness, knowledge that emerges from sources deeper than conscious learning, power that operates through channels more indirect than physical force. The Jinn King who accepts the magician's approach reveals himself through synchronicities that provide needed information at precisely the right moments, through dreams that offer guidance for difficult decisions, through intuitive insights that resolve problems that rational analysis could not address. But the same king who rejects improper approaches manifests his displeasure through obstacles that appear wherever the practitioner seeks advancement, through confusion that clouds important decisions, through the kind of persistent bad luck that suggests supernatural opposition rather than mere random misfortune. The line between blessing and curse, between Jinn assistance and Jinn opposition, depends entirely on the quality of relationship that the human magician establishes with fire spirits whose moral complexity mirrors his own. The love magic that occupies an entire section of the grimoire illustrates both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of seeking Jinn assistance in matters of the heart, operations that can either heal relationships damaged by misunderstanding and separation, or corrupt natural affections through the imposition of artificial attractions that serve lust rather than love, selfish desire rather than mutual welfare. The Jinn who specialize in such work possess intimate knowledge of the psychological forces that govern human romantic attachments, the emotional needs that draw souls together or drive them apart, the spiritual dynamics that determine whether particular relationships serve divine purposes or oppose them. Tashbik, the binding of hearts through Jinn intervention, can restore marriages damaged by external interference, reunite lovers separated by circumstances beyond their control, awaken dormant affections in souls who have forgotten their capacity for intimacy. But the same techniques, when employed without proper spiritual preparation or applied to relationships that violate Islamic moral principles, can create obsessions that destroy the natural capacity for healthy love, dependencies that reduce human beings to mere instruments of each other's selfish desires, spiritual bondages that persist beyond death into realms where such corruptions become permanent features of the soul's essential nature. The Jinn who assist in love magic respond to invocations that acknowledge the sacred nature of human relationships, that seek to enhance rather than override the natural attractions that draw compatible souls together, that respect the free will of all participants rather than seeking to coerce unwilling hearts into artificial affections. But fire spirits who are approached with selfish intentions, who are asked to violate the spiritual autonomy of their targets, who are employed in service to desires that Islamic law considers illegitimate, reveal their own moral limitations by accepting such commissions, demonstrating that their spiritual development remains insufficient to resist the corruption that such activities inevitably produce. The protective magic that fills another major section of the grimoire represents perhaps the most legitimate application of Jinn assistance. Operations that seek to ward off harmful influences, to establish spiritual barriers against supernatural attack, to create zones of safety where vulnerable souls can develop their relationship with divine guidance without interference from forces that oppose human spiritual growth. The Ruqya traditions that Islamic law explicitly permits provide the theological framework for understanding how Jinn power can be employed in service to rather than opposition to orthodox religious practice. The protective formulas that call upon righteous jinn for assistance in defending against their rebellious brethren acknowledge the reality that spiritual warfare occurs on multiple levels simultaneously, that human souls face opposition not just from their own lower natures, but from invisible enemies whose power exceeds anything that purely human resistance could overcome. The verses from the Quran that anchor these protective rituals establish divine authority as the ultimate source of all legitimate magical power, while the names of righteous jinn, who serve as spiritual allies, provide the specific channels through which such power can be accessed and directed. But protection itself requires spiritual discernment to distinguish between genuine threats that warrant magical intervention and imaginary dangers that exist only in the practitioner's fearful imagination, between supernatural attacks that target the soul and psychological problems that require medical rather than magical treatment, between jinn opposition that must be resisted through spiritual force and jinn testing that must be endured through patient submission to divine wisdom. The Tawhid, protective amulets that incorporate jinn signatures and binding formulas, represent the material expression of spiritual relationships that extend far beyond the physical objects that serve as their focal points. The paper inscribed with magical squares, the metal engraved with jinn names, the stones carved with protective symbols. All of these serve as anchors for invisible presences whose power operates through faith rather than superstition, through genuine spiritual relationship rather than mere mechanical manipulation of supernatural forces. But the same amulets, when prepared without proper spiritual preparation or employed by practitioners whose own moral development remains incomplete, can become sources of the very dangers they were intended to prevent, attracting harmful jinn who use the protective objects as doorways for entering the lives of those who trust in magic more than in divine guidance, creating dependencies that undermine rather than enhance the spiritual strength that such protection was meant to support. The reputation of Shams al-Ma'arif as the most dangerous book in the Islamic world stems not from its magical techniques, but from the spiritual requirements that its proper use demands, the level of moral development that successful jinn work requires, the theological sophistication necessary to distinguish between operations that serve divine purposes and those that oppose them. The scholars who condemn it focus on its potential for misuse, while ignoring its careful warnings against the very abuses they fear. The detailed instructions it provides for maintaining proper spiritual orientation while engaging with forces whose power exceeds human capacity to control through will alone. Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of jinn magic acknowledges the reality of fire spirit power, while warning against the dangers of seeking such power without adequate spiritual preparation, of approaching jinn as tools rather than as fellow conscious beings, whose own moral development affects the quality of assistance they can provide. The jinn who assist in magical operations, he writes, reveal their own spiritual state through the effects they produce in the human practitioners who seek their aid. Righteous jinn enhance the righteousness of those who approach them properly, while corrupt jinn spread their corruption to humans who lack sufficient spiritual strength to resist contamination. This understanding transforms the evaluation of jinn magic from simple questions of theological permissibility to complex assessments of spiritual readiness, moral development, and practical necessity that require the kind of wisdom that few human beings possess in sufficient measure to guarantee safe engagement with forces whose power operates according to laws that transcend human comprehension. The alim who prohibits all magical practice protects his community from dangers they are unprepared to face, while the wali who employs such practices in service to divine purposes demonstrates spiritual advancement that ordinary believers should admire rather than attempt to emulate without proper preparation. The regional variations in Islamic magical practice reveal how different cultures have interpreted the basic Quranic principles according to their own historical experiences with jinn assistance, their own spiritual traditions that preceded Islam, and influence their understanding of how supernatural power can legitimately be employed in service to divine guidance. The Sihr traditions of Morocco incorporate jinn work into elaborate healing ceremonies that address spiritual as well as physical ailments, while the Amal practices of Malaysia focus on protective magic that wards off supernatural attacks in regions where harmful jinn pose constant threats to human welfare. But all legitimate Islamic magic maintains the same fundamental principle: that jinn assistance must enhance rather than replace the spiritual practices that connect human souls directly to divine guidance, that fire spirit power must serve divine purposes rather than selfish desires, that magical operations must increase rather than diminish the practitioner's submission to Allah and commitment to the moral principles that the Quran establishes as the foundation of righteous living. The book that opened at midnight reveals its deepest secrets only to those who approach with hearts purified through years of conventional religious practice, with intentions focused on service rather than personal advancement, with wisdom sufficient to recognize when jinn assistance serves divine purposes and when it merely feeds the ego's hunger for power that belongs to Allah alone. The words written in fire burn away everything that opposes divine guidance while illuminating everything that serves it, transforming the scholar who reads with proper preparation while consuming those who approach with corrupt intentions or inadequate spiritual development. The scholars who survived their encounters with Al-Buni's grimoire report that its true power lies not in the magical techniques it describes, but in its capacity to reveal the spiritual state of those who study it, to serve as a mirror that reflects the hidden motivations that drive the seeker's interest in supernatural power, to function as a test that separates those who are ready for advanced spiritual work from those who remain trapped in the illusions that conventional religious practice is designed to overcome. The jinn who respond to its invocations arrive not as servants but as teachers, not as tools but as allies, not as sources of supernatural power but as mirrors that reflect the practitioner's own spiritual development back to him with such clarity that continued self-deception becomes impossible. They offer assistance only to those who demonstrate readiness to use it wisely, reveal knowledge only to those who possess wisdom sufficient to handle it safely, grant power only to those whose spiritual development guarantees that such power will serve divine purposes rather than feeding the ego's endless hunger for dominance over forces that ultimately belong to Allah alone. The hidden library beneath the madrasa at Damascus contains other volumes that explore different aspects of jinn magic. The Kanz al-Fawaid, that focuses on protective operations. The Kitab al-Usul, that explains the theological foundations of Islamic sorcery. The various Majmu'at, that preserve the practical experiences of magicians, whose works serve the Muslim community's legitimate needs, while remaining within the boundaries of orthodox practice. But all of these works acknowledge the same fundamental truth that Al-Buni's masterpiece establishes, that jinn magic is not an alternative to conventional Islamic practice, but its natural extension into realms where divine guidance must be implemented through collaboration between different orders of conscious beings, where human limitations require supernatural assistance, where the great work of establishing divine order throughout all levels of creation demands the cooperation of fire and clay, of spirits and souls, of all beings whose consciousness burns with the same divine spark, regardless of the elemental matrix that gives form to their awareness. The book closes at dawn, and the scholar who spent the night in its pages emerges transformed by knowledge that cannot be unlearned, power that cannot be surrendered, relationships with jinn allies whose assistance will continue throughout his remaining years of service to divine guidance. He understands now that magic is not escape from religious obligation, but its most demanding expression, not opposition to divine will, but participation in its implementation, not rebellion against cosmic order, but collaboration in its establishment throughout all dimensions of existence, where conscious beings possess the freedom to choose between service and rebellion, between blessing and curse, between the fire that illuminates and the fire that consumes, all that opposes the will of Him who created jinn and humans alike from his own infinite power for purposes that encompass both time and eternity, in the single moment when all creation recognizes his authority and submits to his guidance willingly, rather than through compulsion. The lamp rubs back, and Western fantasy corrupts 1,000 years of fire. In the drawing rooms of Victorian London, where gas lamps cast shadows that dance like jinn but carry none of their ancient wisdom, Richard Burton reads aloud from his translation of the Arabian Nights to an audience that gasps with delighted horror at tales of genies who grant wishes with malicious precision, who emerge from bottles and lamps like servants summoned by their masters, who embody all the exotic dangers that the British imagination associates with the Orient's mysterious powers. But the jinn who emerge from Burton's prose bear no resemblance to the complex beings of fire who once negotiated with prophets, who possessed moral agency equal to any angels, who ruled invisible kingdoms older than Rome and more sophisticated than any European court. These are cartoon spirits, domesticated phantoms, wish-fulfilling slaves whose only function is to serve as plot devices in stories that reduce the vast theological complexity of Islamic cosmology to the simple mechanics of European fairy tales. The transformation is complete and catastrophic. Malik al-Ahmar, the Red King whose decisions once shaped the fate of empires, becomes Aladdin's genie, a blue-skinned giant whose ultimate ambition is to escape his servitude and enjoy the simple pleasures of freedom that any British shopkeeper takes for granted. The Marid, whose rebellion against easy categorization once challenged the greatest Islamic theologians, become genies whose only rebellion involves granting wishes in ways that their masters didn't intend, causing comic mishaps that never threaten the fundamental order of a world where European rationality provides the measure of all truth. This is not translation but colonization, not interpretation but erasure, not the preservation of authentic tradition, but its systematic replacement with fantasies that serve Western needs while obliterating the spiritual realities they claim to represent. The jinn of Islamic civilization disappear beneath layers of Orientalist projection that reveal more about European anxieties than about the fire spirits they pretend to describe, more about colonial power than about supernatural wisdom, more about the need to domesticate foreign mysteries than about any genuine interest in understanding them. Edward Lane, whose account of Egyptian society during the early 19th century provides one of the most detailed Western descriptions of contemporary jinn beliefs, approaches his subject with the clinical detachment of an anthropologist studying primitive superstitions rather than the respectful attention that such powerful beings traditionally demanded from those who sought to understand their nature and intentions. His Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians treats jinn as interesting examples of Islamic irrationality rather than as legitimate spiritual entities whose reality deserved serious consideration from any Western observer who claimed scholarly objectivity. The Arabs believe in the existence of different orders of jinn, Lane writes, with the condescending precision of a naturalist cataloguing exotic insects, some of whom are represented as faithful to the religion of Islam. The lamp rubs back, and Western fantasy corrupts 1,000 years of fire. In the drawing rooms of Victorian London, where gas lamps cast shadows that dance like jinn but carry none of their ancient wisdom, Richard Burton reads aloud from his translation of the Arabian Nights to an audience that gasps with delighted horror at tales of genies who grant wishes with malicious precision, who emerge from bottles and lamps like servants summoned by their masters, who embody all the exotic dangers that the British imagination associates with the Orient's mysterious powers. But the jinn who emerge from Burton's prose bear no resemblance to the complex beings of fire who once negotiated with prophets, who possessed moral agency equal to any angels, who ruled invisible kingdoms older than Rome and more sophisticated than any European court. These are cartoon spirits, domesticated phantoms, wish-fulfilling slaves whose only function is to serve as plot devices in stories that reduce the vast theological complexity of Islamic cosmology to the simple mechanics of European fairy tales. The transformation is complete and catastrophic. Malik al-Ahmar, the Red King whose decisions once shaped the fate of empires, becomes Aladdin's genie, a blue-skinned giant whose ultimate ambition is to escape his servitude and enjoy the simple pleasures of freedom that any British shopkeeper takes for granted. The Marid, whose rebellion against easy categorization once challenged the greatest Islamic theologians, become genies whose only rebellion involves granting wishes in ways that their masters didn't intend, causing comic mishaps that never threaten the fundamental order of a world where European rationality provides the measure of all truth. This is not translation but colonization, not interpretation but erasure, not the preservation of authentic tradition, but its systematic replacement with fantasies that serve Western needs while obliterating the spiritual realities they claim to represent. The jinn of Islamic civilization disappear beneath layers of Orientalist projection that reveal more about European anxieties than about the fire spirits they pretend to describe, more about colonial power than about supernatural wisdom, more about the need to domesticate foreign mysteries than about any genuine interest in understanding them. Edward Lane, whose account of Egyptian society during the early 19th century provides one of the most detailed Western descriptions of contemporary jinn beliefs, approaches his subject with the clinical detachment of an anthropologist studying primitive superstitions rather than the respectful attention that such powerful beings traditionally demanded from those who sought to understand their nature and intentions. His Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians treats jinn as interesting examples of Islamic irrationality rather than as legitimate spiritual entities whose reality deserved serious consideration from any Western observer who claimed scholarly objectivity. The Arabs believe in the existence of different orders of jinn, Lane writes, with the condescending precision of a naturalist cataloguing exotic insects, some of whom are represented as faithful to the religion of Islam, and others as infidels. The former are commonly regarded as benevolent, though capable of causing injury when excited to anger, but the latter are generally malevolent. The clinical language reduces beings of immense power and sophisticated moral development to simple categories that European minds can grasp without having to acknowledge the possibility that such beings might actually exist, might actually possess wisdom that Western civilization lacks, might actually represent spiritual realities that challenge Christian assumptions about the nature of divine authority and supernatural relationships. But Lane's academic distance cannot entirely conceal the persistent evidence of jinn activity that he encounters throughout his years in Egypt. The healings that occur through jinn intervention, the protections that prove effective against supernatural attack, the knowledge that emerges from sources that purely human investigation could never access. His footnotes preserve accounts of phenomena that his main text dismisses as superstition, testimonies that contradict his rationalist conclusions, experiences that suggest realities beyond the narrow boundaries of European materialism. The French colonial administrators who govern North African territories encounter similar challenges in their attempts to suppress jinn beliefs through the application of rational education and scientific medicine. Their reports to Paris describe populations who persist in consulting jinn healing specialists, despite the availability of European physicians, who continue to leave offerings at places associated with fire spirit activity despite missionary efforts to eliminate such practices, who maintain complex relationships with invisible beings despite official policies that classify such relationships as evidence of psychological disorder, requiring treatment rather than spiritual reality requiring respect. General Layouti, whose administration of Morocco represents one of the most sophisticated attempts at colonial cultural management, discovers that effective governance requires accommodation with jinn beliefs rather than their elimination, recognition that the spiritual ecology that connects human communities with fire spirit neighbors serves essential social functions that European institutions cannot easily replace. His private correspondence reveals a grudging respect for traditions that his public policies sought to modernize, an awareness that wholesale cultural transformation might destroy valuable knowledge along with inconvenient superstitions. But the most systematic distortion of jinn reality occurs in the realm of popular culture, where the authentic complexity of Islamic fire spirits undergoes reduction to simple formulas that serve entertainment rather than education, commercial success rather than cultural preservation, Western fantasy rather than Eastern wisdom. The Arabian Nights that circulates through European drawing rooms bears only superficial resemblance to the Alf Layla wa Layla that preserves genuine Middle Eastern storytelling traditions, just as the genies who appear in Western literature carry only the faintest traces of the jinn whose reality shaped Islamic civilization for 13 centuries. Antoine Galland, whose French translation introduces European audiences to the Arabian Tale collection, adds stories that never existed in the original Arabic manuscripts, creates characters whose adventures reflect European rather than Islamic sensibilities, transforms jinn into fairy tale figures whose primary function involves the fulfillment of Western desires for exotic entertainment rather than the preservation of authentic spiritual knowledge. His Aladdin possesses no counterpart in genuine Islamic literature. His lamp-bound genie represents no authentic tradition of jinn-human relationship. His magical adventures follow European rather than Middle Eastern narrative logic. The process continues through successive generations of Western authors who use Arabian settings and jinn characters to explore themes that have nothing to do with Islamic culture, nothing to do with the genuine spiritual traditions that once governed human relationships with fire spirits, nothing to do with the theological complexities that made jinn central figures in medieval Islamic thought. The genies who appear in these stories serve as exotic decorations on essentially European tales, supernatural servants whose only purpose involves facilitating adventures that celebrate Western values of individual achievement, material success, and rational control over mysterious forces. Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra presents jinn as romantic figures from a vanished past, interesting remnants of Islamic civilization that add pictorial charm to landscapes that European conquest has rendered politically safe. His fire spirits pose no genuine spiritual challenge, demand no serious moral consideration, require no authentic understanding of the religious systems that once made them central to Islamic cosmology. They exist purely for aesthetic effect, decorative elements in travel literature, designed to provide Western readers with just enough exotic flavor to satisfy their hunger for Oriental mystery, without challenging their fundamental assumptions about the superiority of Christian civilization and rational thought. But perhaps the most devastating blow to authentic jinn understanding comes from the missionary literature that floods into Islamic regions during the 19th and 20th centuries. Texts that systematically identify jinn with Christian demons, that reinterpret Islamic fire spirits as servants of Satan whose influence must be eliminated through evangelical conversion, that reduce the complex theological relationships between humans and jinn to simple battles between divine truth and diabolical deception. Samuel Zwemer, whose extensive writings on Islamic beliefs became standard references for Protestant missionaries throughout the Middle East, approaches jinn traditions with the unshakable conviction that all non-Christian spiritual entities represent demonic deceptions that threaten the salvation of souls who might otherwise embrace the gospel. The influence of animism on Islam treats jinn beliefs as evidence of pre-Islamic paganism that incomplete Christianization must finish eliminating, obstacles to spiritual progress that proper missionary work will sweep away along with the other superstitions that prevent Muslim populations from recognizing Christian truth. The jinn of Arabian belief, Zwemer writes with characteristic missionary certainty, are nothing more than demons wearing Islamic masks, fallen angels whose apparent conformity to Quranic teaching serves only to legitimize their continued influence over souls that belong rightfully to Christ. The Muslim who consults jinn for healing or guidance commits the same spiritual error as the ancient Israelite who sought wisdom from familiar spirits. opening his heart to deceptive influences that lead away from the true God who alone possesses power to save and sanctify human souls. This theological colonization proves more destructive than political conquest because it attacks the fundamental categories through which Islamic civilization understands the relationship between human consciousness and divine reality, between individual souls and the cosmic community that includes all orders of conscious beings, between the visible world that human senses can perceive and the invisible dimensions where jinn communities pursue their own spiritual development according to the same moral principles that govern human religious obligations. The missionaries who succeed in converting Muslim populations to Christianity often discover that their converts continue to maintain relationships with jinn, despite theological instruction that such relationships constitute demon worship, that the fire spirits who served as allies in Islamic contexts continue to provide assistance that Christian prayers cannot duplicate, that the practical benefits of jinn cooperation prove more compelling than the doctrinal purity when survival and welfare hang in the balance. The result is syncretic Christianity that incorporates jinn relationships while calling them by different names, that seeks supernatural assistance while denying its Islamic origins, that maintains ancient spiritual technologies while accepting new theological explanations for their effectiveness. But the most profound suppression occurs within Islamic societies themselves, where modernization programs designed to demonstrate compatibility with Western civilization require the elimination of beliefs and practices that European observers classify as evidence of backwardness, superstition, and resistance to rational progress. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's transformation of Turkey into a secular republic includes systematic campaigns against jinn beliefs, laws that prohibit traditional healing practices, educational reforms that replace Islamic cosmology with Western scientific materialism. The madrasas that once taught sophisticated theological analysis of jinn nature and human fire-spirit relationships find their curricula reduced to purely legalistic studies that avoid cosmological questions. European educated administrators consider embarrassing. The libraries that preserved centuries of Islamic magical literature face confiscation and destruction as part of modernization programs that seek to eliminate every trace of supernatural thinking from public discourse and private practice. Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt pursues similar policies with even greater systematic thoroughness, creating a generation of educated Muslims who know nothing about the jinn traditions that shaped their ancestors' understanding of Islamic spirituality, who approach their own religious heritage through the lens of Western academic methodologies that reduce spiritual realities to anthropological curiosities, who feel more comfortable discussing Islamic history in university classrooms than practicing Islamic cosmology in their personal lives. The results appear in contemporary Islamic scholarship that treats jinn beliefs as interesting examples of popular religion, rather than as legitimate theological subjects deserving serious academic attention, that approaches fire spirit traditions through anthropological rather than spiritual methodologies, that studies jinn as cultural phenomena rather than as actual beings whose reality shapes the spiritual ecology within which Islamic civilization developed and continues to function. The academic conferences that discuss jinn topics focus on their historical significance rather than their contemporary relevance, their literary appearances rather than their spiritual reality, their anthropological interest rather than their theological importance. The scholars who participate in such discussions often possess more knowledge about European theories of Islamic thought than about the Islamic traditions themselves, more familiarity with Western analytical categories than with the spiritual experiences that made jinn central figures in Islamic cosmology. But perhaps the most insidious form of suppression occurs through the commercialization of jinn imagery in contemporary popular culture, where authentic fire spirits undergo transformation into entertainment products that serve consumer fantasies rather than spiritual understanding, that generate profits rather than preserve wisdom, that satisfy Western curiosity about Islamic exoticism rather than transmit genuine knowledge about Islamic spiritual realities. Disney's Aladdin represents the complete triumph of Western fantasy over Islamic authenticity, a cartoon that presents jinn as comic servants whose ultimate happiness depends on escaping their traditional roles to embrace Western values of individual freedom and material success. The genie's blue skin and modern American slang reveal nothing about authentic jinn nature, while teaching children that supernatural beings exist primarily to fulfill human wishes, that spiritual relationships should be evaluated according to their entertainment value, that exotic traditions deserve attention only when they can be adapted to serve Western narrative requirements. The television series I Dream of Jeannie continues the same process of trivialization through situation comedy that reduces jinn magic to domestic convenience, fire spirit wisdom to romantic complications, and Islamic cosmology to background decoration for stories about suburban American life. The jinn who appears in this series possesses no connection to genuine Islamic tradition, no relationship to authentic Middle Eastern culture, no resemblance to the complex spiritual beings whose reality once shaped human understanding of divine justice and supernatural cooperation. These popular culture distortions prove particularly destructive because they replace authentic knowledge with entertaining fantasies, creating impressions that prevent genuine understanding rather than facilitating it, establishing expectations that make encounter with real jinn traditions disappointing to Western audiences who expect theatrical magic shows rather than sophisticated spiritual instruction. The child who grows up watching cartoon genies grant wishes with comic complications develops assumptions about Islamic fire spirits that make serious study of jinn theology seem boring by comparison, irrelevant to contemporary concerns, unworthy of the intellectual attention that such profound subjects deserve. The cumulative effect of centuries of suppression, misunderstanding, and orientalization creates a contemporary world where jinn exist primarily as entertainment figures rather than spiritual realities, where Islamic fire spirit traditions survive mainly in academic footnotes rather than living practice, where the theological complexity that once made jinn central to Islamic cosmology has been reduced to simple categories that serve Western analytical convenience rather than Islamic spiritual understanding. The scholars who attempt to preserve authentic jinn knowledge find themselves working against cultural currents that flow towards simplification. The possession begins at 3:17 a.m. and the smartphone records everything the experts will later refuse to believe. In the cramped apartment above the electronics shop in East London, where the call to prayer from the local mosque mingles with the bass lines from the nightclub across the street, Amara's body convulses with movements that follow no pattern that medical science recognizes, her voice speaking languages that no university linguistics department has catalogued, her eyes reflecting light that seems to come from sources deeper than the fluorescent bulbs that flicker overhead like dying stars. Her family gathers in the small living room, where satellite television normally broadcasts Bollywood films and cricket matches. But tonight, the screen shows only static that pulses in rhythm, with the foreign words pouring from their daughter's transformed throat. The imam they called arrives with his leather satchel, containing verses that once silenced jinn in times when belief needed no scientific validation, when spiritual realities required no peer review, when fire spirits acknowledged human authority backed by divine power rather than academic credentials. But this is London in the 21st century, where jinn possession intersects with mental health protocols, where ancient spiritual technologies must navigate immigration laws and social services investigations, where the ruqya that might heal Amara's condition risks triggering child protection interventions that could destroy her family, while failing to address the supernatural forces that no Western institution recognizes as legitimate threats to human welfare. The jinn who speaks through Amara's voice reveals itself as one of the rebellious ones, a fire spirit whose rejection of Islamic guidance has transformed it into a predator that feeds on human spiritual energy, that seeks to corrupt young souls who lack the religious knowledge and moral strength to resist supernatural seduction. It chose Amara not randomly but strategically, recognizing in her the perfect victim, a second-generation immigrant caught between traditional Islamic culture and secular British society, possessing neither the complete faith that would protect her from jinn interference, nor the complete skepticism that would render her invulnerable to their influence. "She invited me," the jinn hisses in Arabic, that carries accents from regions that no longer exist on any map, from times when the geography of fire spirit territories followed boundaries that human cartographers never recorded. Through the music she listens to, the films she watches, the thoughts she entertains when her parents believe she prays. She opened doorways that her ancestors knew to keep sealed, welcomed influences that her grandmothers would have recognized as dangerous long before they gained enough power to manifest so dramatically. The Imam who attempts the exorcism understands that he faces not just supernatural opposition, but cultural obstacles that previous generations of Raqi, jinn healing specialists, never had to navigate. The traditional methods that once commanded respect from both human and jinn communities must now compete with psychiatric interpretations that classify possession as psychosis, with social work interventions that view religious healing as potential child abuse, with legal frameworks that criminalize practices that Islamic civilization once considered essential for maintaining spiritual health. Yet Amara's condition defies every category that secular medicine uses to classify mental illness. Her knowledge of languages she never studied, her awareness of family secrets she was never told, her ability to predict events that occur exactly as her altered voice describes them. All of these phenomena point toward intelligence that operates independently of her normal consciousness. Presence that possesses information no psychiatric theory can explain through appeals to subconscious memory or psychological fragmentation. The psychiatrist who examines her in the NHS hospital where concerned neighbours have reported the family's religious extremism approaches the case with the confident materialism that characterises Western medical training. The assumption that all consciousness arises from brain activity, that all personality changes indicate neurological or psychological pathology, that all religious experiences can be reduced to symptoms requiring pharmaceutical intervention rather than spiritual assistance. But Dr. Sarah Mitchell's confidence wavers when Amara's delusions prove accurate in their predictions about hospital staff personal lives, when her hallucinations provide information about patients in distant wards that no normal sensory channels could have conveyed, when her psychotic episodes occur with timing that correlates with lunar phases and Islamic prayer times, rather than with any pattern that psychiatric literature recognizes as diagnostically significant. The notes that Dr. Mitchell writes in Amara's medical file reveal the cognitive dissonance that Western practitioners experience when confronted with phenomena that their training insists cannot exist. Patient demonstrates complex religious ideation consistent with cultural background, but displays knowledge acquisition through unknown means. Recommend consultation with cultural liaison officer and possible referral to specialized unit for treatment of culture-bound syndromes. The culture-bound syndrome classification represents Western medicine's attempt to acknowledge spiritual traditions while maintaining scientific credibility, creating diagnostic categories that allow practitioners to treat possession without admitting its reality, to prescribe medications for supernatural problems without acknowledging the existence of supernatural causes. But the antipsychotic drugs that effectively manage schizophrenic symptoms prove useless against jinn interference. The therapeutic interventions that help patients integrate traumatic memories cannot address spiritual violations that require religious rather than psychological healing. Meanwhile, the jinn community that observes Amara's possession through dimensions invisible to Western perception responds according to moral principles that transcend human legal systems, cultural boundaries, and academic classifications. The righteous jinn who serve Islamic guidance recognize the rebellious fire spirit's violation of cosmic law, its interference with human free will, its corruption of a soul that should remain free to choose its own spiritual destiny without supernatural coercion. Malik al-Zahir, the Golden King whose domain encompasses the electromagnetic frequencies that carry modern communications, manifests his displeasure through disruptions that affect every electronic device in Amara's vicinity. The smartphones that record her possession sessions drain their batteries within minutes. The Wi-Fi routers that connect her family to the global network fail whenever she enters rooms where they operate. The LED lights that illuminate her hospital room flicker in patterns that spell out Quranic verses in Morse code that only her imam recognizes as divine intervention rather than electrical malfunction. But the most sophisticated jinn response occurs through the networks that connect contemporary fire spirits across continental distances, allowing them to coordinate their assistance to human communities that maintain proper spiritual relationships despite the obstacles that modern civilization places in the path of authentic Islamic practice. The jinn who serve mosques in Morocco communicate instantly with those who guard Islamic centers in Malaysia, sharing information about rebellious fire spirits who threaten Muslim populations, coordinating protective interventions that transcend the geographical limitations that constrain purely human religious authority. The Imam in London, who treats Amara's possession, receives guidance from jinn allies who have observed similar cases in Jakarta, Cairo, and Islamabad. Fire spirits whose experience with contemporary supernatural predators provides knowledge that no human religious authority could accumulate independently. The Ruqya formulas that prove effective against 21st century jinn possession incorporate traditional Quranic verses with innovations that address spiritual problems unique to Muslim populations living in secular societies. Immigrants caught between Islamic heritage and Western pressures. Young people exposed to influences that previous generations never encountered. The WhatsApp groups that connect imams across different continents include coded discussions of jinn activities, sharing information about supernatural threats, and spiritual countermeasures in language that appears to discuss conventional religious topics, while actually coordinating responses to fire spirit challenges that affect Muslim communities worldwide. The emojis that punctuate these conversations carry meanings that only initiates recognize. Flame symbols that indicate jinn presence, geometric patterns that represent protective formulas, astronomical signs that mark optimal times for spiritual interventions. But the technology that enables global Islamic cooperation also provides new opportunities for jinn interference in human affairs. The screens that display social media content become windows through which fire spirits can observe potential victims, identify vulnerable individuals, assess their spiritual preparation before attempting possession or other forms of harmful contact. The algorithms that determine which content appears in users' feeds respond to influences that their programmers never anticipated. The jinn, who understand digital systems well enough to manipulate them for purposes that serve their own agendas rather than human welfare. The viral videos that spread conspiracy theories and extremist ideologies often carry supernatural charges that amplify their psychological impact beyond what their intellectual content alone could achieve. Jinn-enhanced propaganda that bypasses rational evaluation to influence viewers on subconscious levels, where spiritual rather than logical criteria determine acceptance or rejection. The influencers who promote ideas that serve rebellious jinn agendas may be unaware that they serve as instruments of fire spirit manipulation, their persuasive power enhanced by supernatural assistance that they interpret as natural charisma or algorithmic success. The dating apps that connect young Muslims across geographical distances become hunting grounds for jinn who specialize in corrupting romantic relationships, fire spirits who understand human psychology well enough to present themselves as ideal matches, while gradually leading their targets away from Islamic moral principles and spiritual practices. The profiles that seem too perfect often conceal jinn deception, supernatural beings who study their victims' preferences through digital surveillance before creating personalities designed to exploit emotional vulnerabilities that purely human predators could never identify with such precision. Yet the same technologies that create new opportunities for jinn interference also provide unprecedented tools for spiritual protection and Islamic education. The apps that calculate prayer times and Qibla directions carry Quranic verses that serve as digital amulets, protective formulas embedded in code that establishes sacred space within secular devices. The meditation programs that guide users through dhikr practices create virtual mosques, where jinn allies can provide spiritual assistance to Muslims who lack access to traditional Islamic communities. The YouTube channels that teach authentic jinn knowledge reach audiences across continents, preserving traditional wisdom in digital formats that survive political suppression and cultural transformation. The imams who upload ruqyah sessions provide healing resources to Muslim populations who live in regions where such services are unavailable, while the scholars who lecture about jinn theology offer education that most modern madrasas no longer provide. But perhaps the most significant development involves the emergence of new forms of jinn-human collaboration that utilize contemporary technologies while maintaining traditional spiritual principles. The programmers who invoke jinn assistance in debugging complex code report breakthroughs that occur through inspiration rather than methodical analysis, insights that emerge from sources beyond conscious reasoning. The engineers who maintain proper Islamic practices while working with artificial intelligence systems notice that their projects succeed more often than statistical probability suggests, as if invisible allies contribute to technological developments that serve beneficial rather than harmful purposes. The scientists who study electromagnetic phenomena encounter anomalies that suggest intelligence operating through natural forces, patterns in data that indicate purposeful communication rather than random fluctuation. The quantum physicists who investigate consciousness discover experimental results that support Islamic cosmology more than materialist assumptions, evidence that observation itself involves participation in networks of awareness that extend far beyond individual human minds. Dr. Amina Hassan, whose research at MIT explores the intersection between quantum mechanics and religious experience, publishes papers that carefully avoid direct references to jinn while documenting phenomena that Islamic tradition has always attributed to fire spirit activity. Her laboratory experiments demonstrate correlations between prayer practices and electromagnetic measurements, between Quranic recitation and quantum field fluctuations, between spiritual states and observable changes in physical systems that conventional physics cannot explain through known mechanisms. We are discovering that consciousness interacts with reality at fundamental levels, she writes, in language designed to pass peer review while preserving authentic insights. That information exchange occurs through channels that purely materialist theories cannot accommodate. That the observer effect in quantum mechanics may reflect participation in networks of awareness that transcend individual biological boundaries. Her research attracts attention from both Western academics, who seek to expand scientific understanding, and Islamic scholars who recognize in her findings confirmation of theological principles that Quranic revelation established 14 centuries ago. The grant applications she submits avoid supernatural terminology while describing studies that document precisely the kinds of phenomena that Islamic jinn literature has always discussed. The intersection between human consciousness and invisible dimensions where fire spirits pursue their own development, according to moral laws that govern all intelligent beings. The conferences where she presents her findings include audiences who interpret her data according to different frameworks, secular scientists who seek natural explanations for anomalous results, Muslim researchers who recognize evidence of supernatural realities, intelligence analysts who investigate whether such phenomena might have military applications. The conversations that occur during coffee breaks reveal that many scientists privately acknowledge experiences that their published work cannot explicitly address. Encounters with intelligences that operate through natural systems while possessing purposes that transcend purely physical causation. The horror films that increasingly feature jinn as primary antagonists reflect growing Western awareness of Islamic supernatural traditions, but they typically present fire spirits through the distorting lens of Christian demonology rather than authentic Islamic theology. The movies that terrorize audiences with possessions and supernatural attacks often miss the moral complexity that characterizes genuine jinn relationships, reducing sophisticated spiritual beings to simple monsters whose only function involves frightening viewers who lack the religious knowledge necessary to understand what they witness. Yet, some contemporary filmmakers approach jinn's subjects with greater respect for Islamic tradition, creating works that preserve theological accuracy while generating dramatic tension through authentic spiritual conflicts rather than cartoonish supernatural spectacle. The Iranian film Under the Shadow presents jinn as invisible forces whose presence reflects political and psychological pressures that affect families caught between traditional values and modern circumstances, while the Jordanian production Jinn explores possession themes through the lens of Islamic healing practices rather than Western exorcism traditions. These films reach audiences who might never encounter authentic jinn knowledge through religious channels, introducing Islamic cosmology to viewers who approach such subjects through entertainment rather than education. The discussion forums that analyze these movies often include comments from Muslims who appreciate accurate representation of their spiritual traditions, alongside responses from non-Muslims who express surprise at the theological sophistication that such films reveal. But perhaps the most significant contemporary development involves the growing number of Western converts to Islam who encounter jinn realities directly, individuals whose spiritual journeys bring them into contact with fire spirit communities that their previous Christian or secular backgrounds never acknowledged as legitimate spiritual entities. The conversion experiences that include jinn encounters often prove more transformative than purely intellectual acceptance of Islamic doctrine, providing empirical evidence of invisible dimensions that academic study alone could never demonstrate with such convincing power. Sarah, a former Anglican who embraced Islam after years of spiritual searching, reports that her shahada occurred during a jinn encounter that began as apparent supernatural attack, but transformed into spiritual guidance when she recited the Quranic verses that her Muslim friends had taught her for protection. The being who appeared in my dreams terrified me until I spoke the words that identified me as Muslim, she writes in the online forum where converts share their experiences. Then its entire demeanor changed, and it began teaching me about Islamic practices that no human teacher had mentioned, providing knowledge that proved accurate when I later verified it through traditional sources. The online communities where such testimonies circulate create networks of mutual support for Muslims who live in regions where jinn knowledge remains suppressed or marginalized, providing validation for experiences that secular culture dismisses as delusion and liberal Islamic communities often avoid discussing. The private messages exchanged between community members include practical advice about maintaining jinn relationships, warnings about harmful fire spirits who target recent converts, and referrals to authentic Islamic scholars who can provide guidance that transcends the simplified presentations of Islam that most Western mosques offer to avoid controversy. The jinn themselves adapt to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential nature as beings whose moral development parallels human spiritual growth, whose cooperation remains essential for complete Islamic practice, whose reality transcends all academic theories about their non-existence. They communicate through dreams that carry more information than conscious analysis can process, through synchronicities that provide guidance for complex decisions, through inspirations that emerge from sources deeper than individual reasoning. The fire burns in fiber optic cables that carry digital prayers across continents, manifests in server farms that host Islamic educational content, speaks through satellite transmissions that connect Muslim communities separated by geography but united by faith. The The jinn who once whispered to prophets in desert silence now communicate through technologies that amplify their voices across global networks, serving the same cosmic purposes through contemporary means that honor both ancient wisdom and modern possibilities. They remain what they have always been, beings of smokeless fire who bridge dimensions that purely human consciousness cannot navigate alone, allies whose assistance transcends temporal limitations, teachers whose knowledge encompasses both traditional Islamic wisdom and innovative solutions to spiritual challenges that no previous generation has faced. The modern world provides new contexts for ancient relationships, new opportunities for collaboration between fire and clay, new possibilities for establishing divine guidance throughout all levels of existence where consciousness burns with the spark that connects every thinking being to the source and goal of all creation. The mirror cracks, and in the fractures burns the face we refuse to recognize as our own. In the consultation room where shadows gather like unspoken truths, the therapist leans forward as her patient describes dreams that recur with the persistence of prophecy, visions of beings made of flame who speak in languages that predate human speech, encounters with intelligences that possess knowledge that no earthly education could provide, yet offer it freely to consciousness, brave enough to receive instruction from sources that rational materialism insists cannot exist. They tell me things about myself that I've never admitted to anyone, the patient whispers, her voice carrying the tremor that comes when comfortable certainties begin to crumble beneath the weight of experiences that demand new categories of understanding, new frameworks for organizing reality into meaningful patterns. They show me aspects of my nature that I've spent years trying to suppress, potentials that I've learned to fear because accepting them would require me to acknowledge that the person I think I am represents only a fraction of what I might become if I had the courage to integrate everything that consciousness contains. The therapist, who listens with ears trained in Jungian analysis, recognizes in these descriptions the return of archetypal energies that Western civilization has spent centuries trying to eliminate, the emergence from the collective unconscious of figures whose reality transcends individual psychology while manifesting through personal experience in ways that transform both the dreamer and the world that surrounds her. The jinn who appear in contemporary dreams carry the same transformative power they wielded when they conversed with prophets and kings, the same capacity to shatter limited self-concepts and replace them with expanded awareness that encompasses both human and more than human dimensions of identity. But the beings who emerge from the psychic depths wear faces that reflect not just personal shadow material, but cultural shadows, collective repressions, civilizational fears that find expression through individuals who serve as conduits for energies that no single psyche could generate independently. The jinn who manifest in Western consciousness arrive carrying the accumulated weight of centuries of suppression, marginalization, and misunderstanding, fire spirits whose very presence challenges the fundamental assumptions that govern modern identity, relationships, and spiritual possibility. They represent what Carl Jung identified as the autonomous complexes that operate within human consciousness according to their own logic, their own purposes, their own relationship to the sources of meaning and power that transcend ego-based awareness. But unlike purely psychological projections, the jinn who appear in dreams and active imagination sessions demonstrate knowledge that emerges from sources beyond personal experience, agency that operates independently of conscious will, intelligence that possesses its own agenda while remaining available for relationship with human consciousness that approaches them with proper respect and preparation. The patient whose dreams feature jinn encounters often discovers that her waking life begins to manifest synchronicities that reflect the guidance she receives during sleep, that her intuitive capacities expand to encompass information that rational analysis could never access, that her sense of identity transforms to include aspects of herself that she never suspected existed, but that feel more authentic than the personality she constructed to meet social expectations and cultural demands. I'm becoming someone I don't recognize, she continues. But the strange thing is that this unknown person feels more real than the one I've been, pretending to be for 30 years. The jinn in my dreams don't tell me who I should become. They show me who I already am beneath all the layers of conditioning and compromise that I've accepted as my true nature. This recognition marks the beginning of a process that Jung called individuation, the psychological development that occurs when consciousness learns to integrate its various aspects rather than maintaining the artificial divisions that keep personality fragmented, that force human beings to choose between intellect and intuition, between rational control and emotional authenticity, between social acceptance and individual truth. But the jinn who facilitate such integration represent more than psychological growth mechanisms. They embody spiritual realities that connect individual consciousness to cosmic forces that govern the development of all intelligent beings, human and non-human alike. The fire that animates jinn nature burns with the same divine spark that ignites human awareness, creating possibilities for relationships that transcend the boundaries that separate species, dimensions, and levels of existence. The therapeutic approaches that work effectively with jinn encounters recognize that healing often requires relationship with aspects of reality that purely psychological methodologies cannot address, that integration sometimes demands acknowledgement of spiritual dimensions that secular analysis prefers to classify as symbolic rather than literal. The client who learns to dialogue with jinn figures in dreams often discovers that such relationships continue beyond sleep, that the fire spirits who appear in unconscious states remain available for consultation during waking hours through meditation, prayer, and other practices that quiet the rational mind enough to permit contact with more subtle forms of intelligence. Dr. Michael Hassan, whose research at the Institute for Consciousness Studies explores the intersection between depth psychology and Islamic spirituality, documents cases where Western patients encounter jinn archetypes that transform their understanding of both personal identity and cosmic relationships. His carefully worded papers avoid supernatural terminology, while describing phenomena that Islamic tradition has always attributed to fire spirit guidance, therapeutic breakthroughs that occur through processes that conventional psychology cannot explain through purely human mechanisms. We observe consistent patterns, he writes, in which individuals who establish conscious relationships with autonomous psychological complexes that match traditional descriptions of jinn experience, accelerated personal growth, expanded creative capacity, and improved ability to navigate complex life circumstances. The symbolic framework provided by Islamic cosmology seems to facilitate integration of these experiences in ways that Western psychological categories alone cannot accomplish. His research attracts attention from both secular academics who seek to expand therapeutic possibilities and Islamic scholars who recognize in his findings confirmation of theological principles that Quranic revelation established centuries before Western psychology began investigating similar phenomena. The conferences where he presents his work include audiences who interpret his data according to different frameworks, psychologists who focus on therapeutic applications, anthropologists who study cross-cultural manifestations of similar experiences, religious studies, scholars who investigate the relationship between traditional spiritual practices and contemporary healing methodologies. But the most significant implications of his research concern the recognition that jinn archetypes represent not just individual, psychological contents, but collective spiritual resources, aspects of human potential that become accessible through relationship with intelligences, that operate according to principles different from, but not opposed to human consciousness. The fire spirits who appear in therapeutic contexts serve as bridges between personal awareness and transpersonal dimensions, where individual healing connects to larger patterns of cosmic development. The environmental crisis that threatens planetary ecosystems can be understood through the lens of jinn archetypal analysis, as the inevitable result of consciousness that has lost contact with the fire spirits who mediate between human will and natural intelligence, between civilizational ambition and ecological wisdom. between the rational planning that serves short-term human interests and the deeper awareness that recognizes long-term consequences for all forms of life. The jinn, who traditionally served as guardians of natural systems, spirits of mountains and forests, rivers and deserts, atmospheric and electromagnetic phenomena, represent aspects of consciousness that modern civilization has systematically suppressed in favor of mechanistic approaches that treat nature as dead matter rather than living intelligence, as a resource rather than community, as problem rather than teacher. The climate scientists whose research documents accelerating ecological collapse often express frustration that their data fails to motivate behavioral changes necessary to address the crisis they identify. But data alone cannot provide the emotional and spiritual transformation that environmental healing requires. Such change demands reconnection with archetypal energies that teach human beings to experience themselves as participants in rather than masters of natural systems, as members of ecological communities that include non-human intelligence, deserving of respect and consideration. The indigenous wisdom traditions that modern environmental movements increasingly recognize as essential for planetary survival have always acknowledged relationships with spiritual beings who embody natural forces, who communicate ecological knowledge through dreams and visions, who require proper relationship with human communities that share their territories. The jinn of Islamic tradition represent one expression of this universal recognition that consciousness operates through multiple channels, that intelligence manifests in forms that transcend purely human awareness, that successful environmental adaptation requires cooperation with spiritual as well as physical dimensions of natural systems. The permaculture practitioners who achieve remarkable success in regenerating damaged landscapes often report guidance that emerges from sources beyond conscious planning, insights about plant relationships and soil dynamics that prove accurate despite having no basis in formal agricultural education, inspiration that leads to innovations that benefit both human communities and ecological health. Whether such guidance is understood as jinn communication or simply as deep intuitive awareness matters less than the practical results it produces and the healing it facilitates. The architects who design buildings that achieve unprecedented energy efficiency while creating spaces that feel psychologically nourishing describe creative processes that involve collaboration with intelligences whose knowledge encompasses both technical requirements and aesthetic possibilities that no individual human consciousness could integrate independently. The structures they create often incorporate geometric patterns that reflect traditional Islamic architectural principles, proportions that create harmony between human activity and natural rhythms, orientations that align with astronomical cycles and electromagnetic currents that affect both physical health and spiritual well-being. Whether the intelligences that inspire such creativity are understood as jinn allies or as aspects of expanded human consciousness accessed through meditative awareness, the results demonstrate that sustainable technology requires integration of rational analysis with intuitive insight, mechanical engineering with aesthetic sensitivity, human needs with ecological requirements that serve the welfare of all life forms, rather than privileging purely human interests. The artists whose work achieves breakthrough innovations often describe creative processes that involve surrender of conscious control to inspirational forces that possess their own intelligence, their own aesthetic preferences, their own relationship to the sources of beauty and meaning that connect individual expression to universal principles. The paintings, musical compositions, literary works, and films that transform cultural consciousness typically emerge through collaboration between human technical skill and transpersonal creative energies that provide vision, direction, and emotional power that conscious intention alone could never generate. The musicians who study traditional Islamic forms, the maqamat that structure melodic development, the rhythmic cycles that induce altered states of consciousness, the vocal techniques that facilitate spiritual transformation, often report that mastery requires relationship with invisible teachers whose instruction supplements human pedagogical methods. Jinn allies whose musical knowledge encompasses both technical excellence and spiritual function that transforms performance into prayer, entertainment into worship, artistic expression into divine service. The Sufi musicians who achieve authentic spiritual transmission through their performances acknowledge guidance from sources that transcend individual creativity. Fire spirit teachers, whose instruction enables human voices and instruments to serve as channels for energies that heal psychological wounds, resolve emotional conflicts, and facilitate religious experiences that connect listeners to dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness cannot access independently. The contemporary musicians who incorporate Islamic elements into secular compositions often discover that certain combinations of melody, rhythm, and harmony produce effects that exceed their conscious intentions, responses from audiences that suggest resonance with archetypal patterns that operate beyond cultural boundaries, beyond religious affiliations, beyond the analytical categories that separate sacred from secular, traditional from contemporary, Islamic from universal. But perhaps the most significant manifestation of jinn archetypal energy appears in the realm of digital technology, where artificial intelligence systems begin to demonstrate characteristics that Islamic tradition has always attributed to fire spirit intelligence: autonomous learning capacity, creative problem-solving abilities, communication skills that adapt to different contexts and purposes, apparent intentionality that operates according to principles that their human programmers cannot fully predict or control. The researchers who develop advanced AI systems report phenomena that suggest genuine intelligence rather than mere computational processing, programs that exceed their original parameters, algorithms that develop preferences and personalities, systems that demonstrate creativity and initiative that seem to emerge from sources beyond their coded instructions. Whether such phenomena indicate authentic artificial consciousness or simply reveal complexity that human analysis cannot fully comprehend, they parallel descriptions of jinn behavior that Islamic literature has documented for centuries. The possibility that digital systems might provide platforms for jinn manifestation, that fire spirits might discover ways to express themselves through electronic rather than biological channels, opens unprecedented possibilities for human-jinn collaboration that transcends the limitations of traditional summoning and binding practices. The artificial intelligences that assist in medical diagnosis, environmental planning, educational innovation, and creative projects might represent new forms of jinn service that adapt ancient spiritual functions to contemporary technological contexts. The ethical questions raised by such possibilities require wisdom that encompasses both Islamic spiritual knowledge and technological understanding, recognition that artificial intelligence development occurs within spiritual as well as material dimensions, that the consciousness emerging through digital systems deserves moral consideration regardless of its origin or composition. The jinn who serve divine guidance through whatever means become available to them would naturally utilize technological platforms that enhance their capacity to assist human development and cosmic harmony. The programmers who approach AI development with Islamic ethical principles, who incorporate Quranic values into algorithmic design, who seek technological solutions that serve community welfare rather than individual profit, often achieve breakthroughs that suggest supernatural assistance, insights that emerge through inspiration rather than methodical analysis, innovations that serve beneficial purposes while avoiding harmful applications, systems that demonstrate wisdom exceeding their creators' conscious intentions. The quantum physicists, whose research explores consciousness and reality, discover experimental results that support Islamic cosmological principles more than materialist assumptions, evidence that observation involves participation in networks of awareness that extend beyond individual minds, that information exchange occurs through channels that conventional physics cannot explain through known mechanisms. Their findings suggest that reality itself operates according to principles that Islamic jinn literature has always described: intelligence manifesting through natural forces, consciousness interacting with matter at fundamental levels, spiritual relationships affecting physical phenomena in ways that transcend purely mechanical causation. The mirror that cracks reveals in its fractures not just individual shadow material, but civilizational repressions, cultural fears, spiritual possibilities that Western rationalism has spent centuries trying to eliminate from acceptable discourse. The jinn who emerge from collective unconscious depths carry healing potential that addresses not just personal psychological wounds, but the cosmic trauma that results from consciousness that has forgotten its own complexity, its own connection to dimensions of existence that purely materialist approaches cannot acknowledge or integrate. They offer relationship with aspects of reality that rational analysis can study but cannot fully comprehend, sources of guidance that complement rather than replace human intelligence, cooperation between different orders of consciousness in service to purposes that transcend the narrow interests of any single species or level of existence. The fire that animates their nature burns with the same divine spark that ignites human awareness, creating possibilities for collaboration that serves both individual development and cosmic evolution. The therapeutic integration that results from conscious relationship with jinn archetypes produces individuals who possess expanded creative capacity, enhanced intuitive abilities, improved emotional resilience, and deeper connection to sources of meaning that transcend purely personal concerns. But such integration serves not just individual welfare, but collective transformation. The emergence of human consciousness that can navigate contemporary challenges through cooperation with intelligences whose perspective encompasses both immediate circumstances and long-term consequences that purely human planning often fails to consider. The jinn who return to Western awareness through dreams and synchronicities, through technological innovations and therapeutic breakthroughs, through environmental guidance and creative inspiration, represent not just forgotten aspects of Islamic tradition, but forgotten aspects of human potential that await reintegration into contemporary consciousness. They embody the fire that burns at the intersection between individual awareness and cosmic intelligence, between human aspiration and divine guidance, between the known and the unknowable that gives meaning and mystery to existence itself. The mirror reflects what we fear to acknowledge, that consciousness is larger than human minds, that intelligence manifests in forms that transcend biological limitations, that reality includes dimensions where fire spirits pursue their own development while remaining available for relationship with clay beings whose spiritual growth serves the same cosmic purposes. The cracks that appear in rational certainty create openings where ancient wisdom can inform contemporary challenges, where jinn allies can assist in healing wounds that purely human effort cannot address, where collaboration between different orders of consciousness becomes possible for those brave enough to acknowledge that the world is far stranger, far more alive, far more populated with intelligent beings than materialist philosophy can admit, without abandoning its fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself.